And lastly, we have allergic reactions or hypersensitivity. Now, this is probably something quite a number of you experience, and it's kind of interesting to see why this does happen. So, our allergic reactions or our hypersensitivity, these are not caused by a pathogen. Okay, so no pathogens. Allergic reactions or hypersensitivity is caused by something called an allergen. Okay, now an allergen is an antigen that your body would normally recognize as being non-self, but in a person that is experiencing an allergic reaction or hypersensitivity, that person's immune system produces an abnormal overreaction. So it goes into overdrive and reacts to it as if it's like the end of the world and it needs to destroy it as fast as it possibly can, when this allergen is actually harmless to your body to begin with. Okay? So the main cells that are involved in allergic reactions or hypersensitivity are our mast cells, which will release histamine and cause our inflammatory response, and also our plasma B cells, which produce antibodies. We'll talk about their roles in just a moment. I'm also going to remind you that you can experience a range of severities in terms of allergic reaction, ranging from, oh, I've got itchy eyes or a runny nose when you experience hay fever, or an itchy throat or something like that. That's probably the low end of the scale, where you're experiencing those really irritating signs and symptoms. And then you've got the other end of the scale where you experience something like an anaphylactic reaction. Okay, so they are caused by a similar mechanism. The only difference really is the location of this reaction occurring. So if we're talking about things like, I'm experiencing hay fever and I've got really watery eyes and my nose is really runny, okay? This overreaction is happening in my eyes and my nose. Whereas someone who is experiencing anaphylaxis, this overreaction is happening in their lungs and in their airways, because their airways are swelling, their lungs are swelling, and they're closing off, not allowing that oxygen and carbon dioxide to get in and out. So it essentially is the same thing. It's all about the location. So let's have a closer look at how our allergic reactions are triggered and how these mast cells and antibodies play their role in causing them. So a person is exposed to an allergen. The person's body or their immune system will recognize that allergen as being non-self. Okay, it's treating it as a non-self antigen because it wasn't created by that person. That causes your body to undergo the same immune response that it always has. The mast cells detect it, neutrophils, phagocytic cells come along and engulf it. They have antigen presenting cells that present it to your third line of defense and activate that. And in the process, one of those cells that gets activated in your third line of defense are your B cells, which will differentiate into plasma B cells, and they produce a specific type of antibody in this case called an IgE antibody. And this antibody's function is to actually attach to the surface of mast cells. So in a person who does not experience an allergic reaction or a hypersensitivity to an allergen, when this allergen enters their body and the immune response is triggered, very few IgE antibodies will be produced by the plasma B cells. They will still produce some, but not too many. So what will actually end up happening is these few IgE antibodies that have been produced will be floating around your body until they come into contact with a mast cell, and then they attach to the surface of the mast cell. So in this diagram here, on the slide here, we have a mast cell here. This is our mast cell. And we can see that on the surface of our mast cell, we've actually got 1, 2, 3 IgE antibodies that have attached themselves. So this has happened as a result of being exposed to this allergen, something that would normally be harmless, but your body is still recognizing as non-self. Up until this point, we have not experienced an allergic reaction. So an allergic reaction will be triggered if 2 IgE antibodies on the same mast cell are activated by a non-self antigen at the same time. So what I mean by that is we need to have our non-self antigen attaching to, say, this antibody here, and at the exact same time, we also need it attaching to this antibody over here. Now they're quite a distance apart, so the likelihood that that is actually going to happen is very rare. So individuals who experience this regular immune response don't experience the signs and the symptoms of an allergic reaction. They don't get the swelling, the itching, the anaphylaxis, that sort of thing. Okay. If 2 of these antibodies that are attached to a mast cell were to come into contact with a non-self antigen at the same time, this would actually cause our mast cell to undergo degranulation, which is an extreme process where the entire mast cell is essentially disintegrated and every single molecule of histamine is released in a massive burst. That massive release of histamine is what causes those signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction. So we'll flick over to the next slide and have a look at what's actually happening when we do experience an allergic reaction. So the only difference here between what I just discussed on the previous slide and now is that when the plasma B cell that was activated on the first exposure to our allergen produces the IgE antibodies, originally it only produced a small amount of the antibodies. In someone who experiences an allergic reaction, a massive amount, so heaps of IgE antibodies are produced, which results in the IgE antibodies completely coating the outside of the mast cells. So it's not just a few antibodies that attach to the mast cells, it is heaps. They're completely covered in antibodies now. So that now means that the gap here between these 2 antibodies, instead of it being really wide, they're actually quite close together. So the likelihood that an allergen could actually attach to both antibodies at the same time is now very, very high. In this current situation, we don't have too much of an issue because these antibodies were generated in response to initially being exposed to the allergen. Those antibodies, before they've even attached to the mast cell, have probably cleared up that allergen and removed it from the body. It's if an individual is exposed to that same allergen again, so you're exposed to the same allergen again, but that allergen is then going to enter the body, and because these antibodies have already been placed on the surface of the mast cells, the mast cells are not going to detect the allergen as they regularly would. They're going to use the antibodies to detect it. So here in this part of the diagram, we're seeing our mast cell detecting our allergen on the second exposure. And because 2 antibodies have interacted with the allergen at the exact same time, it is causing our mast cell to undergo degranulation, where it's essentially exploding and releasing an absolute massive amount of histamine, which causes all those signs and symptoms that we were describing. So things like swelling, redness, itchiness. In extreme cases, that swelling can cause your airways to be blocked off because the blood vessels surrounding your airways have swollen so much. Your airways are now sealed. So just another way of looking at that example. So we're exposed to our allergen. In this one, we're looking at pollen. It enters our airways and triggers our regular immune response, which will eventually result in plasma B cells producing our IgE antibodies. Those IgE antibodies will attach to our mast cells and prime our mast cells. Sometimes we can also use the word sensitization to describe those antibodies being attached to the surface of our mast cells. So that's our initial exposure to an allergen. Haven't actually had an allergic reaction yet, we've just been exposed to it for the first time and our mast cells have been primed. It's on our second exposure that we're going to experience that allergic reaction. So on our second exposure, when that allergen enters our body, so the pollen for this example, because our mast cell has been primed with a massive amount of IgE antibodies, the likelihood that our pollen allergen here is going to interact with two antibodies at exactly the same time is very, very high. And that's what we see here. Our allergen is interacting with two antibodies at the exact same time, and it is causing our mast cells to undergo degranulation, where a massive amount of histamine is released at one time, and that then causes the signs and symptoms of an allergic reaction.